Gabriel Papa, and today I'll be presenting my Reader Scholars project, typically focused on leadership studies, titled Purpose, Process, and Possibility, Making Sense of Leadership. Today my presentation overview will consist of these things. I'll start with a basic introduction, then share with you my rationale for the study, my project's thesis, and then go into the foundation and the basis of which I used, which were scholarly texts. From there, I will talk about the leadership interviews and the participants that helped me out with that, and then draw my conclusions from this project. Beginning with a quick introduction, my personal background, I'm from Honolulu, Hawaii, and I've been really involved in leadership since middle school. Really take great pride in terms of helping others, being really involved in my community, and giving back anytime that I can. Leading by example is something that I find myself doing a lot, and like I said before, take great pride and appreciate those who do the same. Some of my future aspirations are directly connected with leadership. I plan on becoming a CEO of a company one day, more specifically a Fortune 500 company, and then later on going home back to Hawaii to run for governor of the state. So a lot of things involved with that. But so going on to the rationale for this study, again, the purpose of this project, touching upon that very first part of my project title, the purpose. And the rationale for this study, again, goes back to this is a subject that I'm very interested in. Again, it's my desire to enact and inspire positive change, not only just me, but in others, and have others do the same, and as well as having a commitment to growth. And again, that's not just my personal growth only, but to the growth of the individuals who I interact with, and I like to see them perform very well also. Starting with my project thesis, it is leadership is practiced differently in a limited way. I'll continue more on this as we go through the presentation today, but this is something very interesting I'd like you to think about while I begin. Like I touched upon before, the foundation of my project is based on scholarly texts. In working with my sponsor, Dr. Decker, we picked these scholarly texts to go from The Practice of Adaptive Leadership, Drucker on Leadership, Strategic Intuition, and Reframing Organizations. Beginning with the first, Adaptive Leadership, there are 5 parts to leading adaptive change that are identified in this book, and those are the introduction to diagnose, mobilize, seeing self in the system, and leading effectively. For the first one, in terms of introduction, we really want to help, from this book I learned that we can help your organization and the community around thrive in this challenging world. We can enable practice of leadership regardless of position, and we really want to, the book tells us to equip you to lead the change. It's more so an action-oriented kind of thing. That's the introduction. And really, it's really vested in purpose and possibility, part of my title. Another book that I touched upon was Drucker on Leadership. Here in this book, there were 5 elements identified. They were leaders' role in shaping the organization's future, ethics and personal integrity, the model organization that Peter Drucker identifies, and that is the military. The 4th one would be motivation and leadership. And the 5th, of course, he identified would be marketing a model of leadership. The first one, in terms of leaders' role in shaping an organization's future, it's really determining the business of the organization, what you're involved in. From there, you can actually be very strategic in your plan and have a creative sense. And Peter Drucker really stresses the fact of developing strategies that you can go to solve the kinds of problems that are out there before implementing the plan. The second one, dealing with ethics and personal integrity, it's really Drucker's view on business ethics. He talks about effective leadership and personal integrity, the people who are affecting change. And there are 7 deadly sins of leadership that he identifies, which are pride, lust, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and gluttony. These are the things which must not be done. And of course, he also stresses in that same ethical and personal sense with integrity, social responsibility as well as corporate responsibility to do no harm. The third one, in terms of the model organization, he identified as the military in terms of its structure. He touches upon lessons from Xenophon, which is the Greek general in command, and really led the army and really set the stage for leadership. The heart of leadership is about command and control in terms of drawing from the text. And it's not about giving commands. It's not just about giving commands. The fourth one, motivation and leadership. It's either command or shared leadership. Delegating authority but not responsibility. The overall leader is responsible for the entire team or the entire organization. So, those kinds of things. Moving on to the third text, strategic intuition. The author of this book, Mr. Duggan, touches upon that, well, not even touches upon, one goes really into depth about many different things. It is not expert intuition, he says, nor is it a means to an end reasoning. Expert intuition, he identifies, draws on what is in your mind about similar situations in terms of the knowledge that we pick up and things like that. Strategic intuition is much different in the fact that it draws together selected elements from different situations in a new combination. So it's you have to really shift your thinking and really shift your focus in that sense. And then the fourth book and the last book that I used to base my research on was Reframing Organizations. And there are 4 frames of leadership that are identified here. They are the structural, the human resource, political, and symbolic. The structural really deals with goals, the roles and division of labor, and the rules in an organization. Certainly that I've touched upon in all of these 4 different books have different approaches to leadership. And this one, again, dealing with 4 different frames of leadership, starting off with the structural. The second one is the human resource frame that is identified in this book by Bowman and Deal. That is the extended family and open communication. So there's that aspect of leadership that must be incorporated. The political aspect is not necessarily focused on conflict resolution, but rather on strategies and tactics. This is where there's the difference between managers and constructive politicians in terms of having success in achieving leadership and really getting that. The fourth frame in reframing organizations is the symbolic frame, and it's the power of symbolism, meaning, and belief. So those are the 4 frames. My sponsor, Dr. Decker, had shared with me that these frames essentially are put in place to eliminate cluelessness so that you get it as a leader. We're going into the second part of my project. After understanding those different concepts that were presented by the text, there were a number of participants that I was so fortunate to have the opportunity to interview, and they were from these 5 different organizations, and they are these here. The Friendly Hills Bank President and CEO, Jeffrey Ball. He was an individual, a leader that we have identified as someone who is very strong and brings a different aspect and different approach to leadership. In terms of talking with Mr. Ball, he shared with me that the way he leads is by example. He gives people the opportunity not only to succeed, but he also gives them the opportunity to fail. And I found that in the interview something very unique and something that I've never really heard before. Because definitely there's all those opportunities, but there's that downside to where you could actually fail at the opportunity that's provided to you. And it's really what you do in your sense to empower yourself to go ahead and succeed at that. He says he's the co-founder of the bank as well. They started in 2006. And he's very humble that although he's the president and CEO of the company, he is not the highest paid individual at that firm. There are people who work hard, just as hard as him, some even harder, and have responsibilities for different aspects of the bank. And they do get rewarded for the kinds of work that they do. And so that's very telling in terms of his personality and the way he leads. Again, he emphasized the fact that he leads by example. The second individual, a leader who we've identified, was trustee Edwin Kay. He's a trustee on the board of trustees here at Whittier College and has dedicated great service to the institution. He serves as a lecturer for the University of Pennsylvania at the Wharton School of Business. During his interview via Skype, he was in China. We had the opportunity to ask him a few questions in terms of what his view on leadership is and what were some challenges that he's experienced. And he was able to share those kinds of things with me. A big challenge that he's faced was actually dealing with someone who was higher, who had a higher rank in the firm, but wasn't really identified as a leader by other people of the firm. And therefore, this person who was above him took on more of a dictatorship role in terms of telling people what to do, not leading by example, not walking the walk, but certainly just talking the talk. And that was a big challenge for Mr. K, or Trustee K, because for him, in his opportunity to thrive, he needed someone, he needed a role model, he needed a mentor to really lead by example, to give him the encouragement early on in his career to really get to where he is today. And now he's, of course, very successful, so he's had some not so good supervisors, and he's had some very fond leaders that he considers mentors. And it really goes back to the relationship, Mr. K, Trustee K had said, the relationships that these individuals form with one another. The third leader that we identified, and I had the wonderful opportunity to interview, was Pastor Matthew Cork. He's the senior pastor at Friends Church in Yorba Linda. At that time, I asked him similar questions in terms of his views on leadership, his challenges, who were some of his mentors, and what he envisions for the future of leadership. And he says it really comes down to the people and their beliefs. Being that he is a pastor, of course, he has very strong beliefs and considers him to be a person who God uses to do his work, to do God's work. And he's very humbled by that. He's as am I, believe that there is that higher being, that higher power that we answer to, and we do everything through him. He also touched upon the fact of leading by example, but he really went into he emphasized leading with heart. He talked about charisma in leadership and how very important it is. He says that he leads by letting other people lead. Although he may have this title as pastor, he feels and believes, and I agree with him, that at the very end, if you strip yourself of all of those kinds of things, you don't have that title. You have yourself, and you have everything that you've come with. And so leading with heart is something very important that he stresses and suggests and gives me that kind of advice in terms of myself pursuing a leadership role in the community to do that as well. Be very considerate of the people that we interact with. The fourth person I interviewed, a leader we identified, was Mr. John Pugh. He's the president and CEO of Cortec Engineering. This firm grew from just a one-employee organization to a multi-million-dollar company that's very successful today. And he owes it to the mentors who has helped him along the way, and the leadership abilities and lessons that he's learned. He also shares by leading by example is something very important, but he also identifies business ethics and really towing the line in terms of your responsibilities is another important factor for leadership. And so those are the kinds of suggestions and advice that he gave to me. So, of course, there's one more person here, and that's Dr. Andy McCall. He's the Vice President of Sales for Meraki Incorporated. It's a technology firm that's making its move internationally. And this gentleman was very busy and took the time to share with me his insight and his experience in terms of leadership, and I'm very appreciative of that. One of the things that he talked about in terms of leadership was really knowing your role, understanding your responsibilities so that you can go out and lead very effectively. Because if you don't know what you're required to do or what you're expected to do, you can't really lead effectively. And the other thing that he emphasizes is to challenge others. For those, in order to become stronger, become leaders on their own, they need to be challenged. And that's something that he really pushed in terms of those kinds of things. So with all of these interviews that I conducted, of course, it's a broad scope of how people view leadership. Their suggestions and advice are very different from each other. Some of them very similar, some of them very common traits and common concepts in terms of leadership. And reading the texts and making those connections with that, there are a few that these leaders certainly touched upon certain aspects of various texts that I talked about, but really there wasn't one leader who was all-encompassing. And that really goes back to my thesis for this project, is that leadership is practiced differently in a limited way. This has been a very unique process for me, again, attributing back to my goals in life and my interest for the participation and wanting to do this project to even learn more. And there are a number of takeaways that I have from this. In addition to the wonderful experiences that I've had with each of these people that I've interviewed and the wealth of knowledge that I've obtained from learning and reading these texts, making the connections has been something very important. And that leads me to the third part of my title in terms of possibilities. And those are the conclusions and what I take away from this, and is that each person's perspective on leadership is limited. It proves my thesis, of course, in terms of interviewing all these individuals and reading the texts, putting them together, and making the connections. There are holes. This further limits the potential to positively impact others, being that we're leading in such a limited capacity. A conclusion that I made would be to create a synthesis of this concept for learning, and that is to incorporate all of the different texts and create my own idea of leadership, taking pieces from these different texts and, of course, infusing the advice that I've gained from these leaders that we've identified. And that's to put together the 4 frames to eliminate cluelessness. Take the 5 elements from Peter Drucker's book and incorporate that, as well as incorporating adaptability through adaptive leadership. And then 4th, to use strategic intuition versus expert intuition. The book, Strategic Intuition, touches upon the blink versus the flash. And then the flash really is to take the time to step back and think about the different possibilities and approach it in a very different manner, rather than having the expert intuition of making a decision in that split second based on what you know. So it's a kind of flip. The last quote that I'd like to leave with you is a quote by Rick Warren that says, if you're leading and no one's following, then you're just walking. And this was a quote that was shared with me by Pastor Cork. And that's something I haven't heard before. And it makes perfect sense. And it puts it into a great perspective for all of us to consider. But again, in concluding, this has been a wonderful journey for me through the process, and of course through the possibilities that are available, the things that I aspire to do. All of these come into play in terms of working into my Whittier Scholars Project and going forward from there. But appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
So we're going to be studying a few different movies, but first, just to give you a background on what a born-again film is, it's a movie that was critically and commercially dismissed upon its initial release. For whatever reason, these movies, they opened to dismal reviews or mixed reviews. They were misunderstood, or they just were underseen, and then they were later rediscovered, reevaluated belatedly, but they did not do well on initial release. Prime example, a prime example is the movie It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart movie from the late 1940s, 1947, I believe. Frank Capra barely made back its budget at the box office. It was nominated for a few Oscars its first year, but didn't win any. It's since gone on, even though it was initially thought of as a flop, to become sort of a holiday classic, a staple, thanks to television and families getting together and watching it over the holidays and whatnot. But I'm not going to be talking about It's a Wonderful Life today. I'm going to be talking about 3 other movies that I really like, which all fit, I think, the definition that I'm running with for born-again films. Those movies are Vertigo, the Alfred Hitchcock film from 1958, Blade Runner, the Ridley Scott film from 1982, and The Big Lebowski, which is a personal favorite of mine and probably, hopefully, other people in the room as well. And that's Coen Brothers film from 1998. Vertigo. Vertigo came out in 1958. Alfred Hitchcock had already been working in Hollywood since the early 1930s. He already had a fair amount of acclaim to his name, but he wanted to make something that was a little more personal. He wanted to make a mystery thriller set in San Francisco, and he decided that he was going to adapt a French novel by, I might butcher these names, Pierre Boileau and Thomas Narcé-Jacques. It was, a film that Hitchcock really had a hard time even getting made in the first place, and he had to make a deal with the studio to do another sort of more commercial, less adventurous film. Anyway, Vertigo it's a crime story. It's about a detective, a private eye played by Jimmy Stewart, who early on in the movie experiences an accident that gives him vertigo for the rest of his life, bad fear of heights. And this old college chum of his asks him to basically spy on his wife because he thinks she's going crazy, and he becomes sort of obsessed, and it's a film about obsession. But anyway, little retreat here. The historical context in 1958. Television was increasing in popularity. Film going was, theater attendance was declining pretty rapidly, and the studio system was dying a quick death. It was not a good time to really release something as personal and audacious and idiosyncratic as Vertigo, but that's what Alfred Hitchcock decided that he wanted to do, and he sort of had the freedom to do it because the studios let him do whatever he wanted pretty much at that point because he made a lot of money. But it opened to decidedly mixed reviews. It was not a hit, to say the least. It grossed $3.2 million in its initial run, compared to Rear Window, which was a Hitchcock film that was an established classic pretty much upon its initial release in 1954. Rear Window made $5.3 million, and North by Northwest, which came out the year after Vertigo in 1959, made $5.5 million. But Vertigo only made $3.2 million. And a few quotes from reviews that came out at the time. Okay, here we go. This is from Hugh, which panned the film upon its initial release. There was a time when Alfred Hitchcock did nothing but turn out 70 to 80 to 90-minute movie masterpieces. They were taut, terrifying exercises in suspense, manhunt, melodramas, eerie tales of murder done and detected, killings thwarted, dangers evaded, and horrifying flights into the miasmic maze of disordered minds. As director, Hitchcock grew more successful, his producers grew more generous. They put more footage in his films and greater production values. Hitch broke the rhythm of his melodramas to make side excursions into scenic beauties and romantic bypasses, elaborately dwelling on lavish settings, costumes, and similar appurtenances. He became entranced by method rather than mood, style rather than substance, gimmicks rather than grim melodramatics, and his pictures became elaborate chess problems in which frequently the beauty of the pieces rather than their moves seemed to fascinate him. Vertigo is a 2 hours and 8-minute case in point. So basically, it was not understood. Another few reviews. Alfred Hitchcock, who produced and directed this thing, has never before indulged in such far-fetched nonsense. Time called it another Hitchcock and Bull story. So it was not popular, and it was sort of misunderstood upon its initial release. In the 1950s, a few things were going on. Cashier du Cinéma, which was a French journal, film journal, was becoming increasingly popular in the 1950s. It was run by basically a few French critics who also saw themselves as filmmakers and ended up making a few very successful films. Francois Truffaut, Andre Bazin, and a few other guys. They started reevaluating films based on the personality of the directors who made them. And it was originally called Le Politique des Auteurs by Bazin in 57, I believe. And it later sort of became translated into auteur theory by a guy named David Bordwell in the early 1960s. Anyway, auteur theory has become a very influential lens through which people watch film. It's become something of a I don't know, something that you sort of study in every intro to film class, and it became, you know, a very popular way of reevaluating certain directors. Where John Ford is a prime example. Made a bunch of old westerns, John Wayne, Stagecoach, Searchers, and these French guys sort of took these movies and said, wait, they have similar themes, they have similar styles, they have similar flourishes, similar you know, genres, but also just things that they're trying to explore. And it became a very popular way of looking at film, and it was highly influential in the reevaluation of Vertigo. And then also in the 1960s, there was sort of a rise of prestige in film studies and criticism in filmmaking classes in academia. It became a much more acceptable and you know, endeavor, and also film criticism was changing. A woman named Pauline Kael was a highly influential film critic. She started writing in the 1950s, I believe, and she eventually sort of became famous working for the New Yorker because she sort of popularized a new colloquial style of film criticism. It's not, does this film follow the established mechanics of what, you know, the thriller should be? Is this, you know, it was sort of, what does this film mean to me? What does this film say? How do I interpret this film? And it was, you know, it's very, you know, A.O. Scott of the New York Times is sort of a more contemporary critic in the Pauline Kael form, but she's highly influential. And again, Vertigo is a film that people find sort of a personal connection with. And I think that this sort of new idea of film criticism, this new way of looking at films, was something that definitely contributed to its critical reevaluation. This is a clip. It's actually A.O. Scott from the New York Times talking about Vertigo. Once I get past
Dirty mouth, huh? What have you been up to?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Always, for a good pain feeling, no matter what. God have mercy.
Does anything ever really happen for the first time? I can't remember the first time I saw Vertigo, Alfred Hitchcock's 1958 masterpiece, one of the greatest movies ever made about Freud's notion of the repetition compulsion, which of course makes it a movie worth seeing again and again and again.
Look, it's not fair. It's too late. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. It shouldn't have happened. It had to happen. We're in love. That's all that counts.
Let me go, please. Let me go.
Listen to me.
Jimmy Stewart, the anxious, angry everyman of American cinema, plays Scotty Ferguson, a San Francisco police detective who develops a crippling fear of heights after he witnesses a terrible accident. He leaves the force and he's hired by an old friend to tail the man's wife, an alluring platinum blonde played by the elegant Kim Novak.
When we are born, There I know. It was only a moment for you. You took no notice.
The assignment becomes increasingly mysterious, Scotty's mental state becomes increasingly disturbed, and after a while, we can't tell what's real and what's projection. This movie shows Hitchcock at the very pinnacle of his powers. It's so tightly constructed and seamlessly edited. The music by Bernard Herrmann is one of the most fantastic film scores ever written, and the views of San Francisco in this saturated, deeply colored cinematography are just breathtaking. Vertigo is usually described as a psychological thriller, and it certainly is one of the best of the genre. Not only because of the psychological state it depicts, but because of the psychological state it induces in us, the viewer. Vertigo is a condition of disorientation and dizziness.
Buffering?
What afflicts Scotty Ferguson through of the movie, but it's also how we feel when we're watching it. And the strange thing is, we feel like we've been here before, we've seen this before, even if we're watching the movie for the very first time.
So that's A.O. Scott of the New York Times talking about Vertigo and sort of a little trailer. It was a movie that when people started talking about how they personally felt when they watched it, it became something. There was sort of this widespread phenomenon with this movie. People became obsessed with this movie. It's a movie about obsession, and people became obsessed with it. People started writing about the work of Hitchcock and Hitchcock's personality and how it came through in his films. One of these people was named Robin Wood, and he wrote about Vertigo in the 1970s. Vertigo seems to me Hitchcock's masterpiece today, and one of the 4 or 5 most profound and beautiful films the cinema has yet given us. He supports this large claim by examining the film's treatment of themes of the most fundamental human significance. So again, it's a movie about obsession, about memory, about how we perceive ourselves, and it's not really a thriller. The mystery of the film is given away, or the big twist, I guess, is given away 30 minutes before the movie ends, and then you're left to deal with the psychological complexities of it, and it's an interesting film. But anyway, it's become a highly influential movie. Brian De Palma, Martin Scorsese, and even more sort of independent experimental filmmakers like Gus Van Sant and Lars von Trier have become influenced by this film in terms of just how it deals with obsession, how it takes psychological complexity and it makes a thriller about the psyche. In 1998, the U.S. Library of Congress looked at Vertigo for preservation for its historical, cultural, and aesthetic significance. It currently ranks number 9 in the AFI 100, the AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies list. It's number 2 on a magazine for Britain Total Films list of the greatest movies of all time. Sight and Sound ranked at number 2 in their greatest movies of all time, and another website that compiles different critics' reviews, and ranks films basically, ranked it at number 2 after Citizen Kane in the greatest movies of all time. Next, we're going to be talking about a film called, here we go, here's a quote from Martin Scorsese. It's difficult how to put into words exactly what Vertigo means to me as both a film lover and as a filmmaker, as is the case with all great films. Truly great films no matter how much has been said and written about them, the dialogue about it will always continue because any film as great as Vertigo demands more than just a sense of admiration, it demands personal response. Blade Runner. Blade Runner was released in 1982. In 1982, there was sort of a dying down, really, of the artistic renaissance that, you know, basically all these new filmmakers coming in, Francis Ford Coppola, Robert Altman, Martin Scorsese, Arthur Penn, making these sort of different, more violent, more sexed up, but also more realistic films. And they had a lot of freedom and they had a lot of money, and the studios had no idea how to make money in the 60s, so they were giving these guys money. But by the 70s, a new sort of, you know, by the 80s, late 70s, a new system took over, and it was sort of a new studio system, and it involved sort of like this mass marketing, big blockbuster. Jaws was sort of the first signifier of this in 1975, but then there was Star Wars, there was Indiana Jones, and Blade Runner was, I guess, marketed and was thought to be sort of, you know, for the studios at least, they thought it was going to be another hit in this mold. They thought it was going to be a popular sci-fi film. And there was sort of a sci-fi fad at the time. And marketing was playing a big role. And also VHS came around in the late 70s. And it was, you know, people were starting to watch movies at home. But it opened to $6.2 million, which was not very good, and it grossed $27.6 million. Total it polarized critics. It was released on May 25th, 1982, because that date was a lucky day, apparently, for the film's producer, Alan Ladd Jr. His two highest-grossing films, Alien and Star Wars, were both released on that day, but neither... Blade Runner did not live up to either film's box office or reputation. It also, the release of Blade Runner coincided with a bunch of other popular science fiction films like The Thing, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and E.T. And it was sort of heavily criticized. It was, you know, polarizing. Some critics really liked it. Most thought it was flawed, mainly because of the pacing and the way that the story was told. It was heavily criticized. Sheila Benson of the Los Angeles Times dubbed it Blade Crawler because I guess people had this expectation that it was going to be sort of an exciting action movie, and Harrison Ford was cast specifically because of his recent successes in Star Wars and Indiana Jones. But it was a different sort of movie. It was, again, a slower, more atmospheric, deeper movie. Here, I'm going to show you, again, this is the original theatrical trailer, which I'm going to stop about 2 minutes into it.
Job is to hunt down replicants. Manufacture humans you can't tell from a real thing.
What's this?
Roy Batty. Probably the leader. There was just one outfit making replicants that superhuman. The Tyrell Corporation.
Mr. Decker, Dr. Alden Tyrell.
I don't get it, Tyrell.
Commerce is our goal here at Tyrell. More human than human is our motto.
I was looking for 6 replicants in a city of 106 million people.
You ever seen this drill, huh? Never seen it. Buzz enough.
What I didn't know was they were looking for me.
Questions?
I just do eyes, said genetic design. Just eyes.
No.
I'm in a bar here now, or sick.
That's 2 minutes of the trailer. I just wanted to show you that because what you get in that trailer is the original Harrison Ford voiceover, which Harrison Ford did not want to do. The studio insisted that people were not going to be able to understand it without Harrison Ford's voiceover narration, and so he sounds really pissed off, actually, if you see the original version, because he's so resentful of having to do it. But the voiceover was taken out in a few subsequent versions of the film. Ridley Scott released a few director's cuts. There's actually 7 technically different versions of Blade Runner. 3 official versions: the original theatrical release, a director's cut that came out in 1990, and a final cut which came out a few years ago in 2007. The director's cut and the final cut added a few more. Well, it added one sort of pivotal scene involving a unicorn, which I'm not going to really go into because I don't have time. I don't want to spoil the film. But it also took out voiceover narration and the happy ending that was originally imposed on the filmmakers by the studio. It also, to me, is sort of the quintessential postmodern film because, well, I don't really have time at all to get into what postmodernism is, but it's sort of, it essentially deals with the question of objectivity and globalization and how we identify ourselves in sort of a huge global community, and sort of confusion and cynicism and questions of identity that comes from that. And I think Blade Runner, to me, really is sort of indicative of a postmodern ethos, I guess. This, I'm going to skip because we don't have time. This is a quote from Roger Ebert. He reviewed the film 3 times for each of its original release and its 2 director's cuts. He didn't like the film the first few times. I mean, he liked the special effects and he liked the production design. He thought it was a technically well-made film, but he did not find it to be a great film. But on his 3rd review of the movie in 2007, when the final cut came out in DVD, he called it a great movie. He admitted it to his canon of great films, and he, I guess, admitted that it didn't really matter that the pacing was slow and that the atmosphere took over. The 3rd movie we're talking about is The Big Lebowski, which is a personal favorite of mine. It came out in 1998. It was directed by Joel and Ethan Coen. It was their first movie following Fargo in 1998. The internet was just sort of taking off, especially when it came to film criticism. The internet sort of helped certain films find a community of people that really that liked them, and they came together. There was a movement started by this guy named Lars von Trier, this crazy Danish director, called the Dog Me 9 to 5 movement, which was sort of the 100th anniversary of the cinema, and he wanted to, it was sort of a call to make films that were more naturalistic, or more realistic, less sentimental, sort of a bare bones kind of thing. And there was a lot of sort of different trends that were going on in the late 90s. There was a lot of big budget, blockbusters, movies that were going to be blockbusters. I mean, they still have them now, but before they were released, like Titanic, which was actually #1 at the box office. The Big Lebowski came out. Armageddon, Deep Impact. There's also a lot of low-key independent films that were coming out at the time. There was a lot of sort of Tarantino, Pulp Fiction rip-offs, ironic pop culture quoting action movies. And there was sort of a lot of slick music video style films. Run Lola Run, David Fincher's movies. A lot of directors came from the music videos, and they're making sort of slick, stylized films. And The Big Lebowski really didn't fit into any of those trends. It opened at $5.5 million. Its total box office cumulative was $17 million. It perplexed critics and audiences alike. I think mostly because they were expecting, I don't know, something that was a little more meaningful, but here's the original trailer to The Big
Yeah, oh yeah, what condition, my condition was in. I woke up this morning with the sun down, shining again. I found my mind in a brown paper bag, but then I tripped I just dropped in to see what condition my condition was in. Just dropped in to see what condition my condition was in.
Yeah, so anyway, Big Lebowski has this real quirky sensibility that would have helped it to become a cult film, but it actually grew a much broader appeal, I guess. This thing called Lebowski Fest was started in 2002 by this guy who really liked the movie in Columbus, Ohio, and people went and they drank White Russians and they bowled, which are sort of two of the, movies, I don't know, not themes, but, for people who've seen the movie. And people, it's sort of this ironic, different sense of humor that I think people didn't get when it first came out. And people didn't get that it meandered for a reason, that it was trying to emulate these detective novels by Raymond Chandler from the 50s. And it was sort of, they were trying to, they're basically, the Coen brothers wanted to see what happened if a stoner entered these already really convoluted landscapes. Anyway, here in the spirit of the Big Lebowski is a rambling, semi-coherent description of sort of the large cult that only recently has developed. And it's really kind of interesting because people, again, it wasn't a personal film for the Coen brothers, but it's a film that a lot of people respond to very personally. And I think all three of these movies, that could be said. But it's people would go to the screenings and they would quote it, and they still do, and it's becoming increasingly popular. And I thought that was a pretty awesome poster because sort of it's a testament to just how popular this film was a huge flop when it was released is today.
And that's a great way to end.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank all of my friends, my advisors, my faculty members, my families, for coming, everyone. I feel like I really do owe a lot to the Whittier Scholars Program, first of all. When I first came here, I was really uncertain of my major. I was actually a declared art and psychology major, and then found the Whittier Scholars Program, partly because I knew I wanted to study something really unconventional, partly because I didn't know what I wanted to study, and like most people that come to the Whittier Scholars Program, I wanted to have a more personal connection to my education. So as I came into Whittier, I began taking classes, met some amazing people, a particular professor, who also ended up being my advisor, who not only was passionate about, but brought me into contact with Russia, studying it as an academic field, and even helped me get myself to be able to study in Russia. And I'll just have a few slides of some of my favorite scenes from studying abroad. As most of you know, my background is Russian. I'm fairly good with the language, and I was really brought up in a pretty unique family, a Russian Molokhan heritage, which is a whole different story in itself. But like many things, because it was all around me, I really took it for granted and didn't actually think of studying it like an academic field, and didn't really understand what my own family history was. So as I started exploring the region in an academic sense and studying abroad, it was like studying part of my own family history, which unfortunately for most Russians is kind of a sad one. And this is actually mostly because of a particular man named Joseph Stalin. So under Stalin's approximate 25-year reign, there were about 3 million people who starved to death by state-induced famines. There were 4 million people convicted by the secret police, and those are really not generous numbers. There were approximately 20 million people killed during World War II, and overall, somewhere between 20 million and 40 million people unwarrantedly died at the hands of or during the time of Stalin. These figures are astronomical. They're just really hard to conceptualize. In fact, Stalin himself said, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is merely a statistic." So as I embarked on my senior project, I knew I wanted to somehow relate it to Russia, but I also kept this in mind, and this really propelled it forward. That and the social scientist in me always had this idea that all of our social hierarchies, our social structures, social frameworks come down to the individual, because the individual is the one who's affected by all of these decisions. And that's really the best way to describe my senior project. It's a social history, more particularly a social history of women. Under communist theory, women are allotted a really particular role. Unlike any other political theory, both Marx and Lenin stated that the communist revolution could not be facilitated unless women were a major part of it. And so when Lenin began creating this new government of the USSR, he really had very specific policies targeted towards women, which is very unusual for a lot of governments. But first of all, before I get to that, there's three things that are really important about Russian culture prior to the Russian Revolution. First of all, Russian culture is very conservative, it's very traditional, it's very religious. Secondly, Russia was mostly peasants. They were mostly agrarian, mostly peasant, therefore not ready for a communist revolution. And peasant life is extremely patriarchal. So going into this new government, Lenin knew this, and he knew that if you're going to shift your government from something very traditional and Tsarist that it was to something that is communist, which are almost diametrically opposed, you really need to change the mindset of your people. And in order to do this, he needed to substitute someone in place of the worker, and the easiest replacement is women, because there's 52% of them in the population, so there's lots of them. They were traditionally oppressed, so they would be receptive to change. And he was pretty smart in the sense that he knew if you want to change this culture, this political culture, from something that's Tsarist to something that's communist, you need to change the mindset of your people. And the easiest way to do that is to target the heart of the home, which is where women are. So the first steps that he took, Lenin actually did, was in 1918, under the Constitution, granted absolute equality granted absolute universal suffrage, except of course unless you were a bourgeois member, but that's beside the point. He set out on several emancipation campaigns which liberated women in work, in social life, in nearly every element of ordinary life. And he instituted in 1918 a pretty monumental family code, which I'm sure you've had time to read over, and amongst other things, legalized civil marriage, didn't make it necessary for registered marriages, and legalized bigamy, incest, and adultery. His motives for this were basically to absolutely free women from any sense of conventional standard and any sense of traditional standard. So this was really his tactic. Well, then Lenin dies in 1924, and there's a huge power struggle within the central government. And you really see this manifested in virtually all legislation, but particularly in social legislation. And in 1926, a new family code was issued, and that sort of shifted, had the same provisions as the previous one, but it shifted slightly in providing, reshaped what constituted a marriage, and the most interesting thing was placing marriages outside of the court jurisdiction, so they became postcard divorces. You could literally just write your significant other that you don't want to be married anymore, and you were thus divorced. So we see the shift. By 1930, Stalin's pretty much consolidated power. He's taken over, and he is starting his reign as the central leader of the USSR. And one of the first things that he did was completely reshift anything that Lenin had tried to institute in 1918. The new draft law of 1936 was printed in the newspapers, basically restructured divorce laws, made homosexuality a crime, outlawed abortion, and favored maternal and custody laws versus Lenin's, which had favored more individual women perspective. He expanded on this in 1944, making it even more conservative and more traditional by giving subsidies to women who had lots of children. You were given the title heroine mother if you had more than 10. He made the divorce process really complicated, very expensive. and he taxed you if you were of marriageable age or of childbearing age and didn't have one. So we see a tremendous shift from what was originally instituted to what Stalin was really perpetuating under his regime. But it's a huge contradiction because at the same time, Stalin also rewrote the Constitution, allotting women absolute equality in all levels of society. So there's really this disconnect between one part of his legislation and another part, which I think this quote perfectly summarizes. We are for the withering away of the state, and we are also for the strengthening of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Is that a contradiction? Yes, it is a contradiction. And he actually stated this in a Soviet government record. And that's essentially what his entire rule was all about. It was one huge contradiction. And this is essentially where my research comes in. I looked specifically at the impact of what he had on social life. I looked at dozens of sources, statistics, census data. I now know how to say really random words in Russian after pouring through Russian census data for a while. And what's really interesting about this time period is right now, especially within the last 5 years, 10 years, but particularly the last 5 years, there have been dozens of new archives being opened up in Russia that have a lot of new materials, a lot of new information coming out that puts a different perspective on what a lot of people have previously thought about this time period. So looking at some of the impacts, one of the biggest impacts that I think is really interesting during the Soviet time period in general, specifically during the Stalinist era, is that the biggest problem was citizens were required to wear the masks of whatever the government wanted you to do. So if they wanted you to be a proletariat, you became one. If they wanted you to be a worker, that's what you became. If they wanted you to be a communist, that's what you became, all for the sake of not getting thrown into jail or sent off to Siberia. So people were constantly changing their identities, changing the masks that they wore in order to accommodate what the central government was asking of them. The problem with this is that when you have a government which is diametrically opposing itself within 20 years, on one hand stating you can be absolutely free in every element of your life, and then 20 years later completely rescinding all those policies and regaling you back into traditional concepts and traditional norms, it's really difficult to know which role to play, and that is one of the biggest problems about Soviet society itself. I'm not going to say that social problems are the reason that it fell, but because we can definitely attribute a lot of the problems in the Soviet Union to political and economic issues, but so the social policy played a huge role, because if you have people at the bottom level not satisfied with their lives, not satisfied with what's happening around them, there's definitely going to be a disconnect, and they're just not going to be able to stand on that solid foundation. And this was, like I said, particularly manifested in what women felt. There also became a huge shift on family, less so on the idea of a woman, more so on the idea of a mother and a family. But whereas women were expected to produce large families, raise good Soviet citizens, they weren't really given the conditions or the provisions to do so. There was notoriously bad housing. There were dozens of rations and shortages and famines that made raising children and living and raising families really, really hard. There were tons of time constraints because women were not only expected to be workers, they were also expected to be full-time mothers and wives. And even when they were in the workforce, there was blatant amounts of discrimination based upon not just your gender, but your class, your status, everything else. Conditions were awful and not very healthy at all. And all of these things really precluded women from living up to the standards that they were supposed to be living as Soviet women. So, once again, there was a huge gap between the policy and the reality that women were facing. And I think the best way for me to probably illustrate this, not that most of you read Russian here, but there's a series of propaganda posters that I collected that are basically in chronological order that you can literally see the changing face of women over the Soviet era. So they go from being extremely emancipated to being much more feminized and much more traditionalized. So what does all this mean? Well, apart from analyzing how social constructs really affect us and affect and how they are really passed down to us through political culture, through social hierarchies, it really offered an interesting perspective on Stalin's reign in general. Like I said, most of the scholarship done is on political and economic levels, but it's really important to look at that. Oh, this one's my favorite. It basically translates, thank you, I guess, Father Stalin, for our happy childhood, even though the majority of people did not have a happy childhood under him. But like I was saying, it's really important to look at that individual level because it offers a really interesting perspective on how deeply he cut into everyday life. It was a totalitarian government in the best sense of the word because he tried controlling every aspect of every person's life. And to some extent he did because there was a huge legacy that he left behind in Russia that not only permeated throughout the Soviet era, but is still relevant today. One of the things he did absolutely was created a tremendous culture of fear. Tremendous culture of fear to speak out, to speak your mind, your piece, and have any dissenting thoughts for fear of being killed, sent away, imprisoned, something like that, which lasted throughout the Soviet era and is still relevant today. I mean, there's still trials going on today where people who are speaking out against the head leadership are getting in trouble. He also created a cult of personality that took an emphasis away from the individual, and people didn't feel comfortable expressing their concerns on an individual level. And that's definitely something that's still true within Russia and their political system today. And finally, he left a huge legacy of having a gender division of labor, the patriarchy, the traditionalism, the bureaucracy, the hierarchy, really was embedded in the Soviet Union at this time and continues to be embedded today. It's interesting, I actually just heard a study on NPR about the gender division of labor and looking at that in developed countries today. And it was looking at several, but the fact of the matter is this is still a really relevant issue that was seen way back when. And there's a lot of books that actually look at this. These are two books that I kind of use as my Bibles for this study. They really explore the individual perspective of this time period, and they are amazing. But so I really built off of this and tried to understand what it was like. And most importantly, this history is really important because if we don't continue to tell about it, it is going to die. It's interesting. There's a journalist named Hedrick Smith who went to Russia in the 1970s and he wrote a book. And in the book, he describes this scene where he's talking to a bunch of college students and he asks them, so how many people do you think were killed by Stalin? And one of the girls says, oh, well, maybe like 20 or 30. And then another says, oh, no, maybe it was like 200. And finally, one other student says, okay, let's be fair. It might have been like 2,000. And then he replies, no, it was in the millions. And no one believed him. So this was only 20, 25, 30 years removed from Stalin's era, and people were already forgetting. And people were already not remembering and not being educated about the things that had happened in their past. And one of the quotes that he writes after describing his just astonishment at this is that if the truth is replaced by silence, silence is actually a lie. So it's important to remember this because even now there's a problem. When I was studying abroad, we talked about this, that so many people don't remember Stalin. There's a huge absence of him in Russia. You see Lenin everywhere, you see World War II everywhere, they glorify it. But there's really nothing mentioned about Stalin, which is good because it means they don't glorify him, but it could lead to that forgetfulness about what he actually did. They tend to just say, oh, he won World War II, but forget about all the tragic things that he did, which are his greatest legacy. And finally, for me, this was a big personal investigation experience, and I just want to leave you with one story. This is a picture of a woman. Her name is Lyudmila Mikhailovna. She was 27 when this photo was taken in the 1950s, probably living in Moscow at the time. She was separated from her family, basically had very minimal contact. In fact, this is the only contact she had with her family because this is my mom's relative. And even though they sent back tons of photos and tons of letters, and they probably tried to send us some, I wasn't alive at this time, but this is the only one I got through with a really short letter. And so it's for women like this who probably didn't have a voice, that I want to remember these stories and recall what happened so that I can give them a voice even when they probably didn't have one. So, are there any questions? interesting. I mean, I'm not an expert on it today, but I mean, one of the things that I noticed is there's still an expectation for them. Like, it's interesting, the culture in Russia today, because there was such a short housing there is still a big problem. So you still have a lot of families living together. Like, there'll be sons who are like 30 years old still living with their moms, not because they want to, but they have nowhere else to go. There's not a lot of housing there, so you still have this expectation for the mom. They still cook the meals. They're still very protective of their kitchens and all that. So there's still those really strong gender roles. And I think now what you're seeing is a lot of traditions coming back into Russia, especially now that the church is there. So a lot of traditional gender roles are coming back, which aren't a bad thing, but aren't necessarily a good thing, because there are still those, they had this chance to maybe be a little bit more emancipated, and they didn't actually follow through on it. So, yeah.
So earlier in the presentation, you mentioned that Stalin legalized bigamy, incest, and something else. So, and he supposedly did that to free women.
Lenin actually.
Oh, Lenin did that.
Yeah.
Well, do you think that? I know that seems less that would give women more freedom, but that would actually sanction atrocities done to them, I guess. I mean, were women allowed to take more than one husband, or was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was. I mean, in practice, it didn't always happen, because you had a lot of very traditional people like not okay with this, especially. I mean, it's hard to eradicate, like I was saying, that mindset from the people. But I think what he was trying to do was just really be radical in all senses of the word. I mean, even legalizing incest today is a little radical. So I think he was really just trying to be absolutely radical, completely destroy all conventions, and I wasn't so much of worrying about. The other thing too that I discuss a lot in my paper, and a lot of the other findings, is that it wasn't so much for the sake of women, it was more for the sake of his country. Like, he wanted this, he had this very big ideologist, where it was all about making sure that the communist revolution was fulfilled, and if it meant freeing women, whatever, we want to move on this path. So that was more of what it was about. But, I mean, there was still definitely a lot of instances of atrocities done to them, for sure. Yeah?
What do you think were the main motivations for Stalin when he was passing these laws to kind of put women back into a traditional?
There was a lot of backlash, because during the power struggles in the 1920s, there was different ideas coming up, and so there was people who had differing views, and a lot of the people that he was with, Origin McKinsey was one of the big ones, was very pro traditions and very pro that separation. So some of it did come out of that, and some of it just came out of the fact that Stalin was pretty unstable as a leader. Some think he might have been bipolar. I wouldn't doubt it. But he did come from he was in the seminary when he was younger, so he had this upbringing of it. And part of it was he wanted to project himself as this fatherly figure, and in doing so, he kind of instituted these policies along with it. But the motivation isn't, he never actually states why he does this, because on one hand, he states, oh no, look, I'm being this really progressive leader, but also does this at the same time. So it was sort of this idea that he wanted the best of both worlds. And the other thing really driving it was he was trying to push industrialization. In order to have that, you need a lot of young workers. So he came up with the problem of, okay, well, I need big families. I need women to really start producing big families. So he pushed policies more towards that. And that just sort of became a side effect of it as well. Yeah.
So now that you've done this project, where do you want to take what you've done? Like, do you plan on continuing this, or?
Well, my major is actually, I'm double majoring in international relations and Russian studies, so I didn't really even touch on most of my international relations stuff with this project. But this for me was, like I was saying, pretty much a personal experience that I don't regret in the least. It was actually awesome learning about all this. But I'm hoping to pursue a career more in the international relations side of it. I'm actually accepted to a couple grad schools next year. We'll not saying exactly which direction I'm going to be going into, but it's going to be in the Russian studies